But another thing too that we have found that has helped families pick more merchandise is sorting the merchandise from the lowest cost item to the highest cost rather than vice versa or by alphabetical order. Families do, again, when they are making arrangements online, they are typically looking for the lowest cost. So if they see that and then you have your default container sorted last that is included in the package, a family is going to be more likely to complete checkout versus going with that SnapLock container.
Welcome to the Direct Cremation podcast with your host, Tyler Yamasaki. Hi, thank you for joining us on the Direct Cremation podcast. I'm your host, Tyler Yamasaki, CEO of Parting Pro, the #1 online arrangement platform. If you like the content, please give us a like, subscribe, turn on notifications, and leave a comment. So today, we are lifting the veil a bit and sharing with you some of the behind-the-scenes data that we see here at Parting Pro. With the massive amount of online arrangements that our clients run through Parting Pro each month, a valuable thing that we get to see is the aggregated data across all of the family preferences. Today, our own head of merchandising, Caroline Andree, will be sharing some of the secret data that we've collected, giving you some key takeaways to increase your contract totals. So please help me welcome Caroline.
Hi,
Hey, Caroline.
Tyler. Thank you so much for having me today. I do appreciate it.
Yeah, of course. So welcome to the podcast. What are you going to share with us today?
All right. So we're going to go into kind of the method behind the madness, how we are currently working to optimize profits and the number of items that are sold for our funeral homes that do participate in our direct shipment program. We will also be talking about some merchandising strategies that could work for you in a traditional funeral setting, just some pro tips to help you overall increase merchandise revenue.
Cool. All right, Caroline. So you're obviously going to be telling us some merchandising strategies and suggestions, I would say, to, better provide choices for your families. Where are you getting this data from? Can you explain how you came across these numbers?
Absolutely. So this is data that I've been tracking through Parting Pro's direct shipment program for urns and keepsakes. So for our funeral homes that participate in this program, we receive a notification every time that there's a paid invoice. And from there, we're able to track where did that invoice come from? Was it as a result of a family completing checkout online? Is it from a funeral home using an invoice template and manually invoicing a family? And also tracking behaviors on the location that a funeral home's at, what type of options are most popular with the families currently. So this is all coming from direct shipment data and all of those orders that we are placing or not placing, and maybe why that order wasn't placed.
All right. So why don't you tell us some interesting facts about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So right now, a trend that we are seeing in funeral home merchandise, especially in the online arrangements arena, is that there has been an increase in the number of scattering tubes that are being ordered. And also, for whatever reason, warmer toned urns are performing better than the cooler toned ones. And for the longest time, I think that the thought was that cool tones like purples and blues perform better in the online space, but currently that is not the trend that we're seeing. So something like red urns, gold urns, and warm toned woods are doing well. But it's funny because it's the opposite for keepsakes and cremation pendants. The cooler toned ones tend to do better there. Again, this all comes from the orders that are currently being placed by our direct shipment department and just seeing what kind of merchandise is being ordered, what isn't. Another quick thing that we are seeing is families are tending to gravitate towards merchandise that is sub $200 when I'm saying a lot. But when a family is making an online arrangement, chances are they are looking for a low-cost direct cremation option. So merchandise that is below $200 MSRP does tend to be the most popular, but every now and again we will get a family that will go for something like a cultured marble urn, which is almost $300 MSRP.
Yeah. I think from our past data before, what we've seen is that, anything over 2,500 usually tends to incorporate more of an in-person setting, or they're less likely to complete it all online. So when you say $200 to $300 as kind of your average, I would say that typically runs about 10% of the total, maybe more if you're really low cost, right?
For sure. For sure. And it really also depends on a number of factors. So, something I'll talk about a little bit more later, but it is, even if you are a funeral home that is participating in the online arrangement space and you offer this as a service to your families, that convenience for them, it's still important to provide guidance on what kinds of merchandise is available and what function it serves. So a family that, if they're just going through and they're looking for the lowest cost arrangement, then they're going to typically go for the plastic snap lock container that's usually included in these direct cremation packages. But if you ask a family how they want to grieve or memorialize their loved one, then that can kind of start the dialogue between you and the family pre-arrangement on what kind of merchandise they might want to go with.
Okay. Well, on average, how many families would you say pick the snap lock?
Yeah, so on average, we're seeing about 23% of families actually go through and select merchandise. This is a trend that we are monitoring because this is now up almost 3% from the last 2 quarters. So before it was staying pretty steady at 20% of families are actually choosing cremation merchandise rather than just going with the default that's selected. So that 3% increase is something that we're monitoring on our end to see what is the best merchandising strategy to continue to boost those numbers so that way more families are actually going through and selecting that merchandise. So 23% this last month alone, we had just over 1,600 notifications come through. That's quite a few orders. That's the best there.
What would you say you can do or ways to increase the amount of families who maybe choose to purchase memorial goods?
Yeah, absolutely. So going back to what I was talking about previously, having that quick conversation with them ahead of time to figure out how they want to grieve, how they wish to memorialize. Do they want a personalized urn? Do they want engraving? Or are they a family that maybe they're one of those families that isn't comfortable with having cremated remains in the house? Then scattering might be a great option for them, as well as there's now a whole bunch of eco or biodegradable friendly options too, where a family can bury an urn and it'll naturally biodegrade over time, or maybe even a water burial for the cremated remains. So there's those salt urns. My personal favorite is the turtle urn that we currently offer. You fill it with the cremated remains and place it in water and it'll slowly sink over time. But it's important to talk to the families because as someone who is yet to have to make their own funeral arrangement, if I wasn't in the profession that I am right now, I wouldn't have known that those were even options that were available to me. But another thing too that we have found that has helped families pick more merchandise is sorting the merchandise from the lowest cost item to the highest cost rather than vice versa or by alphabetical order. Families do, again, when they are making arrangements online, they are typically looking for the lowest cost. So if they see that and then you have your default container sorted last that is included in the package, a family is going to be more likely to complete checkout versus going with that snap lock container. But then to the other point of it, we have seen an increase in the number of keepsake items, so tokens and pendants that families are checking out with. And the most success that we've seen with that is actually sorting the keepsake side from high to low. So another trend that we're monitoring is if a family doesn't necessarily choose a full-size urn for their loved one, they're actually going ahead and they're splurging on merchandise. It's not uncommon for us now to see a minimum of 3 to 6 pendants being ordered because those cremated remains are being split among family members.
Okay. Oh, that's interesting. If a funeral director does have that conversation with the family, are they actually able to make substantial changes in the family preferences?
Yes, they are able to have that impact there where after communicating this to our funeral homes and talking to a couple of them that now I know for a fact they are making that a part of their conversation or they have it in an email template, just points to consider. Those funeral homes have seen a 58% increase in merchandise actually being purchased versus just going with the default container. So it is important, and the more funeral homes that are having this conversation with families, I'm pretty confident that that will help to increase their merchandise revenue in general.
So one thing that I always, it's not that I struggle with, right? And I understand that eco is a big thing that gets tossed around a lot, right? We talk about all the new types of disposition, whether that be alkaline hydrolysis or the composting now that we have. And, as much as, we'd love to say that these are like big things happening, when you really look at the data, I wouldn't say that those are there at any type of real scale yet, right? Like they're coming up and they're worth mentioning, but at this moment, like if you were to look at the percentages of families that choose flame cremation over the others, it's overwhelmingly still flame cremation. And so when you talk about green and sustainable options in merchandise, are we actually seeing those types of numbers being reflected to substantiate the shift to green and sustainable options?
So this is still a trend that we are actively monitoring. So this data is still very new, hot off the presses. So that 10% increase in eco or biodegradable friendly merchandise that is being sold, I think that as time goes on, we will, and the consumers themselves become more savvy or even more aware that these are options that are available to them. We will continue to see that increase in biodegradable merchandise. But this is also where it's going to be important for the funeral homes, the funeral directors themselves, to have that conversation with the families, because you don't know what you know until you're made aware of it. So again, if you're like me and you only somewhat recently got into this and learned that these are options that are available, I wouldn't have even known that. And this is something too where NFDA is now doing they do their consumer report. So there has been almost a 5% increase in families wanting more eco-friendly disposition options, so green disposition options, and whether that be alkaline hydrolysis or body composting, terramation, whatever term we want to call it right now. I would expect that trend to continue, especially now too that these different sides of the industry are starting to have their own conferences and these kind of talks, bringing that awareness more so to the consumer. So it'll be interesting to see how this data aggregates over time, and if this is something that truly should be on the traditional flame cremation funeral homes radar, or is this something that, is it a fad and it's going to go away and flame cremation all day?
Yeah. Well, when it relates to the merchandise, what are you seeing in our data that would signify or not signify that, eco options are actually being preferred?
Sure thing. So the biggest thing is that eco-friendly merchandise right now is on more so the expensive side. I think we're starting around $400. So that can be cost prohibitive to the families that are making these arrangements. But even with that cost, we're still seeing a minimum of 6 of these types of merchandise items being ordered. When I say merchandise here, I am talking about the full-size urns and not necessarily the biodegradable or eco-friendly keepsakes. And another trend too, it really also depends on the location of the funeral home. So if I look more so in the Southeast on more of those coastal states, even in California, those water burial urns are way more popular because of the accessibility to water versus places that are a little more mountainous. Arkansas right now, the number one urns are scattering tubes. So it also depends on a family's accessibility to those specific options to basically honor the way that that merchandise was designed to be used. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah. I mean, that's a lot of good background. But I guess I'd like to just really get into the details, right? You've seen now thousands upon thousands of arrangements now. So what are some of the hottest urns in online arrangements today?
Hottest urns today, again, bearing in mind low-cost direct cremation is the bread and butter of online arrangements. But the most popular urns today are our Eco Scattering urn. That comes from the Living Urn. That one is priced just at $129. The other one, that is MSRP. That's not MSRP, the cost of the funeral home. That's MSRP. That's what the families are paying.
Yeah.
And then the other ones that are very popular are the Ocean Sunset Scattering Tube, priced at $99. And then from there is where we start getting into the slightly more expensive ones. So the next step up from there that families are choosing is, we call it the Avalon urn. It is just a bamboo chest. It's very simple, priced at $165 MSRP. And then families are going, I honestly wasn't expecting this urn to sell as well as it does, but it's our high gloss line. And it's just these standard stainless steel urns that come in red, silver, gold. Those ones are priced at 130. Had to look at my notes there really quick. I apologize for cheating. But when I first put those on the online stores for these funeral homes, it was just kind of a testing the water to see what would the reception be by families. Because when you look at these urns, they kind of look like cookie jars, for lack of a better term. Like they have like the twist off biscuit tin type deal, but families have been loving them. And it's been funny because even after submitting the demand forecast to our vendors forum, we can't keep them in stock. So it's interesting to see what families are choosing based on the type of arrangement and what kind of merchandise they're gravitating towards. Again, I know a large part of this is solely because of the cost, but that specific urn doesn't have the traditional urn design that we're used to seeing. It was slightly different, so that was unexpected. But it's neat to kind of see that trend in the consumer's behavior.
Awesome. So it sounds like the eco scattering, the bamboo. I mean, these are
Correct.
all relatively cheap or affordable, right? Sub 200. Is there anything else that gets a little bit more expensive, or are we all kind of seeing anything under 200?
Yeah. So the other urns that we are seeing that are on the more expensive side, bear with me 1 second. I should have had that pulled up. So this is where we start getting into more of those traditional urns. So we have the diamond urn, which is a blue one that has kind of silver etching engraving on it. It's kind of like a very pretty leaf snowflakey pattern. That one's priced at $230. And then once we get into the simple pewter urns, that one is a high gloss. We call it the Mirage urn. That one's priced at $230 as well. So it's not abnormal to see on average these prices. So we do see families typically going, those are the most popular items that I was previously discussing, but we still do see families that are choosing urns that are between the 220 to the 260 range. That's not abnormal, and that does make up a good chunk of what is being selected, those traditional urns. But the max that we do see families kind of being willing to spend on an urn is right around the 440 range. That's the sea turtle urn that we have, as well as those other urns that are meant for water burial. So again, but those ones, once you start getting above $300 for an urn, is kind of where you start seeing that drop off. So it's just something to bear in mind, especially if you are interested in doing online arrangements, making sure that you're pricing your merchandise appropriately, because if you have an urn that's priced at $500, it's very unlikely that you are going to sell those. And it's also important to bear in mind who the demographic is that typically is doing these online arrangements. They are looking for that low cost direct cremation. So it's important to make sure that your merchandise is priced in a manner where those items are still accessible to those families.
Yeah. I think one mistake that we found, maybe not so much now, but when we first introduced online arrangements to, I guess, death care, we saw that people wanted to just overload their online store with $700-800 urns, because they were saying, well, if we're going to offer such a low cost on the services side, we got to make up for it on the merchandise side. And when you look at things that are 100 to 200% the cost of your services, it's usually not going to sell that many.
Exactly. And another thing too, and I understand where the funeral homes are coming from, where, I got to make up for lost revenue by increasing the cost of the merchandise itself. With online arrangements, Parting Pro specifically, and we just received this testimonial from a customer at ICCFA that we met. A lot of those costs are actually that you wouldn't typically charge for, like your bariatric case fees or the transfer fees if it's outside of a certain range. Those costs are already being recuperated, and you don't even have to necessarily have that conversation with the family. It's being done automatically. So in the words of this funeral director that talked to us, if you're a big softie and you don't typically collect those in that face-to-face setting, you're already recuperating that revenue by having those online arrangements. So if that is something that's important to you, just bear in mind you're already going to be increasing your profits and your revenue automatically without having to have that conversation. So you don't necessarily need to tack that on to the merchandise itself.
Understood. Okay, so let's move into keepsakes then. Keepsakes are kind of wide, and I think we'll separate keepsakes and jewelry because I feel like those are different. But when we look at keepsakes, what are some of the best-selling keepsakes that you've seen?
Yeah, so right now our number one selling keepsakes are the glass songbirds, specifically the blue one. People are loving the songbirds. Those ones are priced at $155 MSRP. So I think I mentioned this previously, where even if you have a family that isn't necessarily choosing a upgraded urn, they are just going with the snap lock container that comes with the package. We are seeing families that are splurging more so on the keepsake side because that is something where you can share it with the family. So the songbirds are very popular. The next one that's going to be popular are the token urns that match the full size urn. So those ones are typically priced between $80 and $90 MSRP. But the ones that we are seeing sell a lot of too are the mini scattering tubes. So those ones will typically go with the full size one. Those ones are priced at $45 MSRP. And we'll see a lot of families just purchase a ton of those so that way every single person can participate in the scattering rather than passing around the full size scattering tube. Everyone gets their own. Or what families will do is if maybe the family members are scattered throughout a state, or maybe everybody wants to take those cremated remains and scatter them in some place special, everybody has the ability to do so with their own little mini scattering tube. So that's another thing that we're keeping an eye on just to see, is that a line that we should expand, or is it something where we should focus more on the traditional token keepsakes?
Yeah. And I know these are probably really hard unless you're really intimate with the merchandising of everything. You probably can't see what these are. So I think we will provide a link where you can sign up and actually get an image of all of these, so you know exactly what we're talking about and follow along. So, you know, just saying a songbird or a picture. There are a lot of similar things out there with songbirds and hearts and scattering tubes. So we'll be able to provide you a link that you can actually get a copy of what we're talking about.
For sure. And something I'm also working on too for both the funeral homes and the families is an actual catalog that is the pretty little flip book. So that way everybody can see what this merchandise looks like. And it just gives a nice, neat presentation without necessarily having to send a family through the online store. So that is something that's being actively worked on. We haven't had one previously, but it's going to be really pretty, I promise. Just picture the urns, though. Just picture the urns. They're there, I swear.
Yeah. All right. So let's move into jewelry then. Are you seeing a lot of jewelry?
Yes. Tons of jewelry. Well? Tons of jewelry. I would say that a lot of times, you know, second to the keepsake size scattering tubes, jewelry is going to kind of outperform everybody. And there is typically more jewelry being ordered. So the most popular styles right now are the traditional cylinder tube that you see all the time as a cremation pendant. The second one is going to be the filigree mom heart pendant. We have a ton of those sell. And then from there, it's different variations of hearts. So we have one model it's called the pearl heart pendant. It has some mother of pearl right in the center, and it has this really pretty filigree around the edges of it. And then the one after that, it's kind of weird to describe, but it's a heart locket, but the locket itself doesn't hold the cremated remains. It's actually a very tiny vial that you fill with the cremated remains that fits inside of that locket. And it still has that really pretty etched pattern around it. Those ones have been very popular. And then the next one that is going to be the most popular is it's called the roped cross. It is just a standard cross pendant, but it has kind of a very pretty intertwined pattern that is on the, what do you call it, the bars? Those are the ones that are currently the most popular. We do see families when they do order a cremation pendant, you will get those one or two. but it's not uncommon now to see families where they choose 4 to 6 of those pendants, but that everybody in the family gets their own type of design. It's not necessarily just blanket order 6 of this one style.
As the merchandising and having all this data, I do know that some of our clients will actually entrust you to, rearrange some of their merchandise selections. How much of an impact have you seen being able to use some of our best selling merchandise in the arrangements versus like something that they may have just thought of or put in originally without using the data as an indicator? Have you been able to see big changes in their contracts?
Yeah, so for our direct shipment funeral homes, I think that based on the data, and it's right now it's kind of hard to pull the data from the customers that are not currently participating in the program. So I don't want to give false numbers. But since we've been kind of optimizing our merchandise selections that are available through our dropshipping customers' online stores, and we've been working to make that available. I feel like this is all word salad, so I apologize. As we've been working to optimize the merchandise selections that are available for our dropshipping customers, month over month, we've seen at least a 3% increase in the number of orders. So, but you multiply that by over almost 1,700 arrangements, it's not an unsubstantial number. And again, going from 20% of families actually selecting merchandise to 23%, this is something where we are seeing that slow improvement. But the biggest thing for the customers that do not participate in the dropshipping program is, again, pricing the items to the point that they are inaccessible to families. So that way they almost always are going to go with the default container or the cheapest option that you have available. But if you have scattering tubes that are selling for, almost $200, families aren't going to be willing to pay for that. And this is too where we need to start considering that the consumers today are savvy. We are competing almost directly with Amazon, and Amazon has a ton of urns and keepsakes. And we always try to communicate the value in purchasing this merchandise directly from a funeral home with the guidance of a funeral professional versus just kind of venturing out on your own. We know the quality is there. So my one big warning would be just make sure that the merchandise, yes, you want to increase your merchandise revenue, but make sure that you don't price it to the point that it is inaccessible to families, or it's to a point where a family says, you know what, never mind, I'm just going to go to Amazon or Etsy to purchase this urn. We're in the e-commerce environment at this point, and this is who our direct competition is right now. And that's just something to bear in mind.
Okay. Caroline, is there anything else that you found to be interesting when you looked at the data?
One thing that I'm keeping an eye on and bearing in mind the age-old adage, correlation does not imply causation. But right now we are seeing a minor correlation between temperature in a region and the number of items that are being sold. So there is currently a moderate correlation for higher temperatures and the number of items being sold. But there is a higher correlation between cooler temperatures and the number of items being sold. So right now, and again, correlation does not imply causation. It's just interesting to kind of start delving into that, especially on a regional basis. So, I'm down in Florida. Florida funeral homes are doing very well, but it is a lot of scattering tubes and kind of water urns. We do still have those traditional ones that are being sold. But then those states that are in the Pacific Northwest, those are the ones that we're currently, or even the Northeast where it's still cooler, those are the ones that we see currently selling more merchandise. So it's just a trend that I'm keeping an eye on. Data speaks, and it is helping to inform a lot of the decisions that are currently being made in the merchandising department. But I just thought that was a fun little tidbit that we are seeing a correlation between those.
That is interesting. I don't know, trying to figure out why that would be, but
I mean, we've talked before about how there is a spike in cases during the winter and sometimes even during the summer months. So that could have something to do with it, but it was just neat kind of seeing what regions are doing better and how it not just like, oh, the Midwest prefers scattering tubes, but how each specific funeral home and what their state's daily average temperature is, how that correlates to the number of merchandise items being sold.
Do you have averages of how much merchandise is being sold per arrangement?
So I don't have that specific total off the top of my head, but I can put together a fun little spreadsheet that we can make accessible for show notes or something if you'd like.
No, it might be interesting. All right. Is there anything else that you wanted to share today?
Just that at the end of the day, too, have the conversation with your families, even if it's something where you are doing online arrangements. Another thing, too, is if you are a traditional funeral home and you have your merchandise available in a showroom, start keeping track of which items are the most popular and playing around with the different displays and seeing which one is going to sell more merchandise. I don't know what kind of data is being kept by your average funeral home, but it's just something to bear in mind. It's fun to kind of play around with it and see how that goes. And the only other thing would be that presentation matters to families. So even at the time that they go to pick up something like the generic snap lock urn, if you can do something special for them, like wrap the cremated remains within the container in colorful cellophane or something, like it's one of those things that will be memorable to a family. So just bear in mind presentation matters. So those are the big tidbits there.
All right. Awesome. Yeah, Caroline, I know that a lot of the merchandise that we have is not going to be extremely unique. You may be able to find others that are similar, especially if you're already tied to a certain vendor or you prefer a certain vendor that you've worked with closely. So as a funeral home, how would you go about optimizing your displays?
Yeah, so this is where I would recommend that you reach out to your vendor, especially for these big companies like Passages International, or, I'm pretty sure Batesville has something like this too, where they have merchandising strategies and what they have found works best for the displays. This is where I would say, at the end of the day, you know your funeral home better than anybody. Take what resonates, leave what doesn't, and just kind of play around with it to see what works best for you to increase that merchandise revenue. But those strategies that these vendors do provide to you, it's a great jumping off point to see how that would work best for you.
Yeah, I will say one of the things that I think we've run up against is that, everyone has a feeling for their customer base and what their preferences might be, but you often find a lot of things in the data that you can't argue against, right? Because it's very apparent once you get mass data of what's going to sell, what's doing well, what families are choosing now. Another question that I have for you, Caroline, is how often do you think these trends are changing, right? I know the data that we're sharing today has been good for the past, let's say, couple months, but have you seen changes since you've started?
Yeah, so the biggest change I have seen is the move away from cooler toned merchandise to warmer toned merchandise, where that has, I would say I started noticing more families opting for cooler toned urns in general
And
in
those being your
September.
blues, greens.
Yeah, blues, purples. A purple urn was our best seller for the longest time, but that's changed. So I would say from September to November, it was cool tones, but from December forward, it's been all about warm tones and warm woods. So it is something that I'm keeping an eye on. You would think that the cooler tones would be more popular during the winter months, but it's the opposite. I can't get into the full color psychology for why families are choosing that specific merchandise. You would think that it would kind of correlate with the temperature of the season, but that's not what we're seeing. So it'll be interesting a year from now to see how the merchandise varies. The merchandise selection varies by family choice over the months versus where we are currently. But where we are currently, it's all about those warm colors. And it's also families just choosing those lower cost options while also opting for more scattering. So we'll see how that plays out, and I'll provide the next update in this upcoming direct shipment newsletter.
And we'll have to track this maybe in 6 months or a year. We'll have you back on to share the updated data where we are today.
Yeah, absolutely. It'll be fun to kind of play around with that and see where we end up.
Caroline, where can people reach you?
Yeah, so I can be reached at caroline@partingpro.com if you have any questions. Or if you reach out to our stellar support team, they can always point you to me. If you don't want to remember my email address, that's fine. Yeah, just reach out if you have any questions. If you want me to take a look at something for you, let me know. I'm happy to take the time to help funeral homes be successful.
Yeah, and we'll also include a link in the description so that you can actually sign up and get a sheet or access to all the urns that we are talking about and all the merchandise that we are talking about, so you can actually see and compare. Even if you aren't using one of the vendors that we have, I'm sure there's going to be others that are similar or at least in the same kind of area. So definitely be available for you. Okay. Well, thank you, Caroline.
Yeah, thank you, Tyler. Thank you for having me. I appreciate your time.
Yeah, of course. For the Direct Cremation Podcast, I'm Tyler Yamasaki. Catch you guys next time. Thank you. Thank you so much for listening. If you've enjoyed this episode, please leave us a review on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. If you ever want to know more, please find us at directcremation.com.